Hello, my name is Hussein Askary. I'm a member of the International LaRouche Movement and Schiller Institute. I work in Sweden for our organization. How much time do I have? Okay, we have an announcement. Lunch is canceled. All right, somebody should close the doors too. Anyway, my presentation intersects a lot of what Helga presented, so we're going to skip some of it or go quickly. All right. Just one note, because what I'm going to present is the other side of the coin of what we have today in the region, Southwest Asia. We have wars and so on. But what I'm going to present is that this is going to be done by the same nations who are involved in war acts or defending themselves against war. So all these nations are nation states. And in a just world economic order and political order, all these nations will have to contribute to this development. So it doesn't matter if it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, all these nations are considered nation states, and they should be sovereign. But the policy has to change. The other thing is that many of the projects which I'm going to present, what Helga presented, many of them are already being built. Some of them are finished. The problem is that these are local projects, and they don't have, they lack the global planetary dimension and perspective. So this is what we're going to add through our plan to this, that this is a planetary mission. So anyway, I've been working with the question of Southwest Asia many years as a member of the organization, and there's a recurring problem the whole time I meet and talking to both citizens but also political leaders from Southwest Asia. Say, how can you present an economic program at the time when we are being shot at? We have war. So how can you talk about economic development and projects in the middle of a war? The problem is that there are lots of excuses. The reason is that these nations did not do what they were told or they were supposed to do before they were getting shot at. Missed many years since Lyndon LaRouche was in Baghdad in 1974. We lost a lot of time. The other thing is that some people say we don't have money. And as soon as they finish talking to you, they go around the corner and they go buy weapons for hundreds of billions of dollars because they say we are in a war situation. But anyway, there's another excuse which is difficult to deal with, and it's true because they say we are not capable of doing these things because world politics is not decided by us. It's decided by the big powers. And that's true. That we can discuss. And that's what we need to change. So if our friends in the United States can impeach President Obama, and if our friends in England can help us put Tony Blair in prison, then we will have a totally different situation where we can discuss these things, and people will not have excuses because we can turn the whole imperial policy. And if somebody can please tell Mrs. Merkel to wake up, that would be very helpful because we are soon in 2013, and Germany is being suffocated. Germany is a technical superpower which is needed by the whole world. It's being suffocated by the current policies, the environmental policies, green policies, and the financial monetarist policies. So Germany's role is very important in this whole situation. But I wanted to focus on some questions of principle because as I have the outline is that we have to define really what is the purpose of existence of the human race. It's not about competition, as modern economics say, or seeking vengeance for old political injustice, or winning land, take it from others. What is really true about human existence is that it's implementing our creative powers to change the universe around us. I mean, you don't necessarily have to be a physicist or astronaut to change the universe around you. You could be a farmer, a teacher, or ironsmith who finds joy in applying his creativity and passion to his area of work and make others around them happy. But we do need scientists. We do need astrophysicists. I'm going to take a quote from Kraft Ericke, a German space pioneer and thinker. I don't know if we have. He says in his extraterrestrial imperative, says, the fact that neither technology nor reaching beyond Earth is exactly new, but natural growth options exercised before, puts the human reality of our time into perspective. The reality has two anchor points. One, that the chlorophyll, which is responsible for the photosynthesis, that the chlorophyll molecule and the human mind are the only true superpowers on this planet. They must find a way to coexist, and, not being intrinsically incompatible, they can. Two, that humanity does not live as a mankind generally, but is organized as an aggregate of some 140 nations. Now there are more. Most of these nations strive to improve their standard of life or safeguard social standards achieved and extend them to the less advantaged. Without the means to grow, and like it or not, these means include material resources and the ability to process them, general stagnation will create a shrinking water droplet world in which competition for growth turns into a grim struggle for survival. So the purpose of governments and political institutions is to secure an environment within which the individuals can practice their creativity. Our responsibility as citizens and political activists is to kick those elected politicians and governments in the back to make them do their job. We can also give them some useful suggestions about what needs to be done, which we are going to do here. The research of what I'm going to present now is not my work. It's a teamwork which was done by a team from the Executive Intelligence Review, both here in Europe and in the United States. We have Dean Andromedas, Ali Sharaf, Marsha Mary Baker, and also Dennis Small, who made a study on the American deserts, have contributed to this study. And of course, we have to thank Chance McGee and Matthias, who are going to lead us into the animation of these projects. So the perspective from which we're going to act is this geopolitical situation involves conceptualizing what should instead be going on here in this region from the highest level perspective of the strategic defense of Earth, true development of mankind and the universe they inhabit. We will consider this in terms of three main principles. One, upgrading the resources base, in particular water, by organizing what is present available to higher levels. Number two, by making new natural resources and by upgrading the power per unit area. And three, through the productive platform, which LaRouche calls it productive platform, which is the infrastructure, agro-industrial sector, social advancements, and the scientific and technological level of the society. These are the same principles which were implied actually originally in Lyndon LaRouche's proposal for the Oasis Plan, which was presented in Baghdad in 1974. These are the same scientific and moral principles. Helga went through this question of the world desert, if we have the map. This is a global desert. Helga mentioned the 13 million square kilometers. I mean, if you compare that area, which is largely depopulated, with the areas where you have the 6 billion human beings on Earth, it's almost larger than where we have the rest of mankind. In countries like in Egypt, 80 million people live on only 4% of the land. 96% of the land is totally empty. So we have people here in Europe and the United States talking about overpopulation of the planet. We are depopulated. We don't have enough people on Earth. We have too much space, but that space is dead. If you look at the relationship between this desert and the Eurasian land bridge, or the world land bridge, which Helga presented, and we have been working on, what we're going to have is this is a huge planetary mission, which has enormous dimensions, and it could only be considered from a planetary perspective, which also involves that we have an agreement among the big powers and the regional powers to work together to achieve a shift from this desert to what we can see could happen later. I would like to start by going directly to the Southwest Asia region with some images of sandstorms. Sandstorms and dust storms are a frequent event in Southwest Asia, especially in the Gulf region, but even extends to Iran, Afghanistan. Now, if you look at satellite images, these are satellite images. That's why we need space technology to determine what is going on Earth. As you look at the, if you can slow it down, if you look at where the sandstorms start from, which go from north to south, these are Arctic jet streams, wind, that come with a high-pressure area and meets a low-pressure area on the Gulf region and the Arabian Sea. So when you look, you figure out that the sandstorms, they start in the border area between Iraq and Syria. That's exactly where the Euphrates ends. And then they sweep down and gather strength. They go over Iraq. You can show the next. This is a close picture where it starts, if you can see. It all starts there in Syria and then goes over Iraq. These are images, I think, these are collected by NASA and European Space Agency satellites. And around March 2011, there was a huge sandstorm which covered the whole area. So you can go to the next. And then the sandstorm, and these storms, they can be, if you can look at pictures of them on the internet when they attack cities. It's like enormous apocalyptic images. I don't have them here, but these the dust storm can be, sandstorms are up to tens of meters, but the dust storms, they can up to kilometers in the space. And they cover whole countries, and they shut down airports, ports, hospitals, schools, and everything. So then it continues into the Persian Gulf, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. I can go next. And then they take a turn around the highland there in the central Saudi Arabia, and they dump the sand in the empty quarter. That's called the empty quarter. But in this case, the sandstorm was so powerful because you have a mountain range there in Yemen and Oman. So the empty quarter this is the most dry part of the world desert. So, but in that case, it just continued down over the mountain range into the Gulf of Oman, over Yemen and Oman, and then continues into the sea. You can see also the next images. It goes all the way also into the Arabian Sea. They cover sometimes Pakistan, India. You have other storms which also attack Iran and Afghanistan. So this is a recurring problem. So with the help of the space technology, we can see where the sandstorms originate and where we can start attacking them. So the question is now, for Qatar and Saudi Arabia to stop this, it doesn't help to send jihadists and weapons to Syria and Iraq to kill civilians. That will not help stopping this problem. What you need is a totally different perspective. So that perspective, we can start attacking the desert at different areas and with different technologies. There are plans in these regions that have been there. As I said, these are local plans, but they can give an image. If you look where the area the sandstorms start, which is now a war area, and the land is deteriorating and the desert is expanding, if we have what's the so-called Fertile Crescent. These are also examples. Egypt also attacked by the Hamasine winds. Also the sandstorms, they can reach Europe sometimes. China is also a problem. This is not the Shiite crescent. This is what His Excellency, the ambassador, is saying, the Shia crescent. This is not the Shia crescent. This is called the Fertile Crescent for obvious reasons. This was an area which was very fertile. There's abundance of water. And some historians say agriculture all started in this region. But the problem is that is not fertile anymore, and it's deteriorating, and the water resources are shrinking. We're going to talk about the Turkish dam projects which have affected the flow of water, but that's not exactly the only reason. It's the destruction of the infrastructure by wars, sanctions, and lack of investments which has created this situation. So this is the idea of where you can attack for example, this sandstorm problem. So there are ideas they are called green belts. What you can do is you can create green belts. Can I have some example? This is an idea from the Iraqi Agriculture Ministry. Since I was a kid, we used to read about these in school, that we have a national program to protect the country against sandstorms and deserts. And it's quite an impressive plan, but it was never realized. I wasn't born in 1968, and immediately we had a civil war in 73. We had Iran-Iraq war in 80. We had the Gulf War in 1990. We had sanctions. So it's just continuing. Nothing has happened. But there are courageous efforts to build part of this. We have actually an Iranian-Iraqi agreement to build a green belt around the religious cities of Najaf and Karbala. I think we have some image. So what you do is that you plant different types of trees, mostly palm trees, olive trees, eucalyptus trees, tamarind trees. These are trees that are known for resisting heat, resisting salt, and they are water scarce. They can survive in dry climate. So this is the project in Iraq. It's a small project, but this is the kind of, it gives you an image what you need to do. But instead of just a few hundred meters, the green belt should be several kilometers. And then you have rows of these, and you expand, as we saw in the Iraqi plan. It's like you have a shield of green belts, and you move gradually against the desert. We're going to talk about the irrigation techniques and other things later. So the idea of planting a variety of plants is not new. We have, this is from the Egyptian, it's called the grave chamber in one of the Egyptian pyramids. This is a painting on the wall, and you can see the variation of you have palm trees, you have other fruit trees, and you have other plants, and then you have crops, of course, which you need to produce food, wheat, cereals, and so on. So these are old ideas. They have existed there. We have very skillful farmers, but they lack resources. They need the issue with Helga was emphasizing recently that these are not things we can do in 10, 20 years. These things we can do next week. There are people there, farmers and unemployed young people. They can start work immediately next week. And we can start planting trees next week. There's no problem. What is lacking is the policy. We don't have a policy. We have a policy of destruction. We don't have a policy of construction. We can move forward. This is also an interesting image sent by an Egyptian friend of us, an engineer, agricultural engineer. It's just the same thing. The palm trees, what is special about them is that they can work as a wind shield, but they also can stabilize the soil. But what they do also is that they can create shadow for other types of trees. He sent me a study he did on olive trees. Olive trees, if they are planted alone under the sun, their productivity will be diminished by about 50% because the heat will kill a lot of in the kernel of the olives. But if you plant it in a shadow of a plant, their productivity will increase. It's a cooler area. But there's an interesting reference to this we have from the Holy Quran, where there's a story of two men, and there's a conflict within the two men. But the Quran says, it's in the Surah of the Cave, and it says, "And present to them an example of two men. We granted to one of them 2 gardens of grapevines, and we bordered them with palm trees and placed between them fields of crops. Each of the 2 gardens produced its fruit and did not fall short thereof in anything. And we caused to gush forth within them a river." So this is exactly what we got. This is the techniques, agricultural techniques according to the Quran. But what we're going to do is we're going to remove one thing in the modern techniques. We cannot have open canals nowadays because most of the water would evaporate. We have to cover all the water streams. We're going to have, I will just describe it. But the Quran may excuse us that we remove that part because we need the modern technique and adjust to today's situation. These are palm trees, and they are very productive, of course. You all have eaten dates and so on. So these are not only to protect against dust, but these are a source of food and energy for the population. There are different ways of stopping the desert. This is called dissing. It's used a lot in China, where you spread. It's very labor-intensive. That's the problem. You create these cross-sections of dry trees or reeds, and then you try to stop the advancement of the desert, and then you plant in these areas. But the problem is that what you need to do is you have to bring the water infrastructure first. So you can't dig the water infrastructure later. You have to do it before starting this. But this just gives you an idea. You can go further. This is from Libya in 1950s. It's the same concept. But this is in the China Taklamakan desert highway. They tried to protect the road from the sand. The sand moves the whole time. It's like snow in the Arctic regions. So they try. They pump water from the underground. It's salty water, but they have planted types of plants that resist salt. So that's also a question for a scientific development. You have to develop new types of plants who can resist salt water, or they can resist heat. So this is also a technological level. So this is one idea, but unless you deal with this in a larger context, you cannot limit the desert. But these are images to show what is being done, but it needs to be generalized. I don't know if we have any more. Yeah, so any reasonable person would ask first, after saying all these nice things, so where would the water come from? Which is a good question. So what we are defining in our report is that there are three sources of water which are available or may be available. First, you can transfer water from areas which are rich with water to these water poor areas by so-called water diversion system. Helga went through some of these, the Ob, Irtish, Aral Sea. You have also in the another one which goes to the east of the Ural Mountains. It's called the Pechora, Kama, Volga Canal. Also, there are these rivers go and, like the Nawapa project, they end up in the Arctic Sea. So the idea is to stop them from going to the Arctic Sea and divert part of the water and reverse the movement of the water to rivers that flow in the opposite direction. So Helga went through these, so I'm not going to go through that. Can I go next? Yeah, this is what His Excellency the Ambassador was talking about. It's called Iran route, popularly. There's very little information about that. It's good you mentioned there's a feasibility study being done. There are, of course, big technical problems. Iran is a desert country and semi-arid country. You have these two large deserts called the Dashti Kavir and the Dashti Lut. And the same idea. If you bring water, Iranian engineers have been looking what they're doing. Is by just bringing, even if salt water, because this is very salty land too. These were ancient lakes or part of a sea. And when the sea sank, the salt was left. But just by the mere fact of bringing water to the region, you can create a new climate situation, a cooler climate situation, which will affect the region and will affect Afghanistan. What you can do simultaneously, you build desalination plants along these areas, and you have fresh water for agriculture, urban use, and so on. So you can bring life to that region, and you can help Afghanistan also with the expansion of the desert, and so you can have forest, also green belts in that region. There's another plan from the other side of the Caspian Sea, which also I think Helga mentioned, is you bring water from the canal I mentioned, and you pass the Caspian Sea, and you bring it to Iran at the northern shore of the Caspian Sea. There's a technical problem because you have to bring it across a little pass in the Alborz Mountains. But all these things are doable. There's no problem. And then you bring the water down to the Karkha and Karun rivers. There are lots of dams being built there, but the amount of water there is also decreasing. So you need new water. Like we have a crisis in Iraq because of the dams in Iran on the Karun River, that the water in the Shatt al-Arab in Iraq is getting lower. So the Gulf Sea water is moving inland and affecting Basra and these other regions. So, but you can't stop building these things, but what you need to is to increase the development. So you don't go backward, you go forward when you have a problem. You don't destroy the dam because the water is becoming less. Can go to the next. This is what Helga described as the Turkish, this southeastern Anatolian project. It's a massive project. There's one problem with that. There are several problems, but the project in itself is sound. There's no problem about that. But political disagreements and wrong agricultural policy is affecting the efficiency of that. I will come to that later. So this is the southeastern Turkish, southeastern Anatolian project. The GAP is called. And the idea is to build dams on the Tigris and the Euphrates and have huge reservoirs, like the Ataturk Dam reservoir. The lake behind the Ataturk Dam has enough water for a whole year of the Nile River's water flow. A whole year is like about 49, 50 billion cubic meters. So in times of drought, these are very useful. But they have to be used. The water got to be used in the sound way. This is the Ataturk Dam again. Okay, we go further. So we cover the eastern part of what we have, the so-called Middle East. The problem with the Middle East is the term is that the region seen from Britain. If you look at the region from Britain, you have the Far East, you have the Near East, you have the Middle East, and so on. We call it Southwest Asia. That's more appropriate name. We have this is also a water diversion plan, which Helga described, bringing water from this will come not from the Tigris and Euphrates basin. This will come from the Ceyhan, Jihan, the rivers. They are more to the west of Turkey. They don't affect the Tigris and Euphrates. The water flows into the Mediterranean, so you divert part of that water in pipelines all the way down to the Arabian Peninsula. So we go further. We jump over the Middle East, Southwest Asia, to Africa. I think we have described earlier, I'm not going to go through them, but in the work of the Schiller Institute, we have the Transaqua Canal to refill the Chad Lake, which is a big humanitarian and environmental crisis, by bringing water from the Congo. All that region has to be developed. I mean, Africa is witnessing horrific crimes right now because the resources there is being utilized for global economy, but the population there are being slaughtered and moved from their lands to clear the place for the multinational raw materials cartels. And this is what's going on in Eastern Congo. They have been going on for a while. So the perspective should include the development of Africa, and I think our friend from Egypt who's going to present the Africa Pass project will discuss that. So what we discussed now is that the first source of water, you bring water from water-rich areas to water-poor areas. So that we clear that. The second source is, of course, water desalination. Now, there's massive investment in water desalination going on in the Gulf specifically. Saudi Arabia, I mean, they're investing heavily in water desalination for urban use, for drinking water, sewage, and so on in the cities. And 50% or 70% of Saudi Arabia's drinking water comes from desalination. Saudi Arabia alone produces half of the global water desalination amount. These are huge amounts of water, but they are not enough, of course. But they are investing heavily into that. United Arab Emirates, too, Bahrain, Qatar, all these countries are building massive water desalination plants. The problem with that is that they are using natural gas and oil for the thermal, for producing the heat. Producing the heat, which will help in the evaporation process to desalinate the water, to remove the salt. Now, the problem is that in the coming 2 decades, these countries in the Gulf, for example, they would need to double and triple the amount of water they desalinate to match the growing population and economic growth. The problem is that already today, Saudi Arabia, for example, they burn 1.5 million barrels of oil every day to produce that water. So imagine in 10, 15 years, they will have to burn 4 million barrels of water to meet only the urban drinking water problem. So that's not really sustainable in a sense. So what the Lyndon LaRouche and Helga and others we have been proposing is to build nuclear desalination plant based on nuclear power plants. And the idea is called Nuplex. This idea is not new. Actually, and President Eisenhower, one of the ideas he had for solving the Arab-Israeli crisis is by providing assistance to the Egyptians, Israelis, and these other countries by building small nuclear power plants to desalinate seawater and bring, because most of the Israeli wars against the Arab countries, they're not based on religion. Most of them are based on controlling water. Israel comes into a new area. When you see that the Israelis occupy a new area, you have to look if there's a river there, if there's groundwater reservoirs, if there are lakes. So most of the wars have been about controlling water. And the Israelis have been doing it actually brutally in the Palestinian areas, which created deep crisis. Now in Gaza, for example, there's a United Nations report released in October which says that Gaza will not be livable in 2020. There's no water anymore. The aquifers are emptied. I mean, the Israelis took what they took and before they left. But now the aquifers, which are shallow aquifers next to the sea under Gaza, they are being contaminated. They have intrusion of the salt water into them, and people are just getting sick from the water. So Gaza immediately needs a desalination plant to produce 500 million cubic meters of water every day. Now, I met the water minister of Palestine in Oslo, in Stockholm, in a conference, water conference, and he said, we are going around begging Europeans to give us 250 million. I mean, the Qataris and Saudis promised $250 million to half of the cost of the plant, but they are getting nothing. $250 million can save millions of lives in Gaza, and they are not getting it from Europe. And the European Central Bank and European governments are bailing out banks for not hundreds of millions of dollars, but billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is really a tragedy, you know. It's a moral problem. So that's just to take an example of this, the water problem. So we have these images of the Nuplex. As I said, going back to Eisenhower's plan, this is what the idea is. Now, actually, there are these kind of floating nuclear power plants. The Russians have built them for their Arctic icy region. These are small-scale nuclear power plants, and they are floating like in a ship, and they are placed near the coasts. So you can do the same thing, actually, with the region very quickly. You can build these things very quickly and ship them from Germany or from Sweden or France or wherever. To the region, and you can place them on the shore, and you can desalinate water and produce power for industrial and other use for these regions. Helga mentioned that there is actually an active plan for there are active plans for building nuclear power in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, which is these are good signs. One thing about the United Arab Emirates is that, you know, the 4 nuclear power plants the Koreans are building cost about $20 billion. That's the agreed cost. You can't really imagine how much is being wasted. Abu Dhabi, which finances this thing, Abu Dhabi pays Dubai, which is another emirate, $20 billion a year to pay debt to international banks who finance the real estate boom in Dubai. The whole Dubai miracle was based on credit. It's one of the history's largest land scams. And they did not introduce any modern technology. People travel to Dubai, they will see the traffic jams because they build these huge towers, but the roads are not efficient. They accommodate to this development. Now they are thinking about building rail transport systems in Dubai, but that's going to be difficult because you will have to remove buildings, you know. So, no, but the enormous waste. I mean, the United Arab Emirates so-called sovereign fund is $750 billion, and they invest in football clubs in France and in England and even the Qataris. This is becoming famous. Every sheikh has a football club. So there is no lack of resources to do these things. But it's welcome that the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have decided. I mean, as Helga said, Iran is the only country which has a running nuclear power plant. And the original German design by Siemens to build the Bushehr plant it included desalination of water. Now, in the Russian design, that's not included. So this has to be also included into the Iranian plans to connect the nuclear power to the desalination. You can use the thermal heat for that purpose. But there is an awareness in the region that that's what you need. I mean, in Egypt, there are plans. I mean, they know that they have to do that. Egypt has a plan to also build nuclear power plant on the Mediterranean, which the Egyptian agriculture minister I met in Stockholm, the water minister, he said, we are going on with the same plan. This plan have existed a long time, but they know that without nuclear power, you cannot provide water to the coastal areas in the western part of Egypt. So the whole idea is based on the LaRouche Oasis plan. So Helga described these things. We have both canals from the Red Sea and Dead Sea to the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is about 430 meters below sea level. And the water there is disappearing because of all the using of the Jordan River and the Litani and other rivers by both Israel and Syria and Jordan. So the level of the water in the Dead Sea is sinking a lot. So you can refill the water by salt water from the Mediterranean. But the idea, and then from the Red Sea, this project to build a canal which goes downwards to the Dead Sea, and you can use the difference in elevation for hydropower. The idea was to produce, to desalinate water with that power, which Jordan needs a lot. That project it's dead. It doesn't exist anymore because of all these political destabilizations. But all the studies and all the engineers, they are ready to build them. So that this question of the peace, which the paradox I said earlier, that people say you cannot build economic development before you have peace, or you have political stability first, and then you can build the economy. That's not true. And this is what really happened with the Oslo peace process. Mr. LaRouche, in an interview after the signing of the Oslo Accords in the White House in September '93, he said in an interview, the urgent thing here is that we must move with all speed and immediately get these economic development projects, such as the canal from Gaza to the Dead Sea, going. Because if we wait until we discuss this thing out politically, enemies of progress and enemies of the human race, such as Kissinger and his friends, will be successful through people like Sharon's buddies in intervening to drown the agreement in blood and chaos. And guess what happened? This is exactly what has happened. The Oslo Peace Agreement and the peace process is dead now. But it can be revived. It's not, should not give up on that. That's the last thing we want to do. So this is the example of how you can create peace and stability through economic development. It was very possible, but the United States and Europe didn't do that. They encouraged the Palestinians to do tourism projects in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, selling souvenirs to European and American tourists. And actually, they even used the land in the Palestinian areas with the little water to export flowers, Bloomston, to Europe. And say, that's how you get cash. And then you can use the cash for economic development. And they use the water, which they're supposed to use for feeding the Palestinian people, to produce vegetables and flowers to export to Europe. The same thing happened in Egypt, too. You export vegetables and fruits, but you have to import wheat and rice from the United States so you can feed the people. So the whole policy towards Palestine and Israel from the United States and Europe was a total disaster. They didn't contribute anything. They contributed to the downfall of the peace process. This is something which LaRouche has, and our organization, we are screaming the whole time. That was the reason I joined the organization in '94, because for the first time somebody came to me. I was living in Oslo, actually. I met some of the Palestinian and Israeli people. I was working as a translator there with Palestinian and Israeli children who were coming at the signing of the agreement to like a cultural festival. And when the Schiller Institute people came to Oslo, it was the first time I met them, I saw that they're talking about economic development, that without economic development, you will not have peace. I said, oh my God, I had left Iraq 2 years earlier after the horrendous wars, and I still had this idea. And somebody comes and say, well, you can prevent wars by economic development. If you don't have economic development and dependency among nations for their survival, you will not have peace and stability. So that was the reason I joined the organization. Of course, there are other reasons, but that was the first thing. He said, somebody comes here with a new idea. All the other ideas never worked. This can work, but what we need is, the Schiller Institute cannot implement these projects, but we can get politicians and nations to do them. So this is the second source we said for bringing water is desalination of seawater. There are seas all over the place. You just remove the salt and you have fresh water. You need enormous amounts of energy. You can use nuclear power, new generations of nuclear power plants, high temperature. So the third source of water is the so-called aquifers. There's something called the watershed. I just, there's one thing. If we go back to the desert map, the global desert. Because the thing is, what I said, you have to deal with this as a global, planetary mission, where you have to attack the desert. I like to say it's a war. I want to have a new war in Southwest Asia, but it's a war on the desert. So, but you cannot deal with the desert with small projects here and there, like the United Nations and the FAO and the European Union are doing. They are not going to help anything. You have to generalize these projects. But what you can do, the desert has certain vulnerabilities, because you can cut the desert into regions where you have these different sources of water. For example, you have what we call these mountain ranges and the Atlas mountain ranges. They have a watershed. The North African mountain ranges, it's a watershed. Franklin Roosevelt discusses underground rivers in the book by his son, because he was discussing why these areas are not developed, this desert. He said the rain falls on the mountains and it goes underground, but it disappears under the sand. So if you divert that water, you can make the desert green. Roosevelt already in the 1940s had this idea. I mean, he had done it in the United States by greening the Imperial Valley and building the Tennessee Valley Authority. So people in the United States, they knew about these things. But you have mountain ranges where you have rainfall, but that rainfall does not guarantee. I will come back to this idea of watershed, what watershed is. But you can use, then you have in the middle of Africa where the Transaqua project is. I don't know. You can see the. So you can utilize sources here. You can have nuclear power here. You can attack it from north and west. But then you can cut the desert here by the Transaqua Canal. So you diminish the effect, the accumulative effect of the desert as total. So you have to cut it into sectors and attack it at each sector with these three water sources we said. The groundwater is the third source. Then we have the Africa Pass. Our friend Ayman is going to discuss that. I'm not going to go through this. You have the desalination plants. You have the Turkish projects here, the Greenbelt projects here. You have the Iran route project here. You have the Aral Sea project here. You have Chinese. And I'm not going to go through the Chinese because it takes a whole day to discuss what the Chinese are doing. It's just incredible stuff. They're diverting water. Like this, the biggest water diversion projects in the history of mankind. But I'm not going to go through it. So the idea is you have to cut the desert into sectors, different battlefronts, and attack it in each battlefront with these water resources we have, or we can develop. So the third source is the groundwater. Now there's an enormous scaremongering in international organizations, the UN, especially the United Nations Development Program, environmentalist organizations, and also, different organs, even governments buy that now. The scare story is that you cannot pump water from the ground. The first thing is because the water eventually will finish, the soil will become salty, and it will be poisonous. So you should not pump water. And then they say there are, at the same time they say you should not build nuclear power. But there's an enormous campaign to prevent nations from using groundwater by scaring them into accepting to die thirsty rather than using the resource which we have. Now there is a, can I have some water? Water is important. There are now using space technology, and something which Ali has worked a lot on recently, is by using space technology, there are two scientists who are mostly known for what is called the mega watershed model. These are Robert Bisson and Farouk Elbaz, an Egyptian-American scientist who worked at NASA mapping the moon before the moon landing for NASA. He's a very renowned scientist, and he's an old man now, but he's still active. He goes to Egypt every now and then and presents his projects. He has a project which is called the Development Corridor to build a Nile valley next to the Nile. So anyway, the idea is that they contradict this traditional view of how underground water develops. So the traditional story says you have rain in the highland, in the mountains, and then the rain goes over the surface in creeks and streams and rivers and end up in the sea. That's most of the water. A lot of it evaporates. And then part of the water goes underground in the sedimentary areas and is locked between the sedimentary areas and the rock levels below them, and they get trapped in that area. So you have a horizontal local aquifer with a certain amount of water. So the problem is that if you have, like we have in our region in Southwest Asia, it doesn't rain the whole time, then that trapped water will be overused. That's true, you can overuse that water. And as in the case of Gaza, it can become a problem. But this conventional theory, which is accepted as a term in meteorology and the United Nations and other organizations, excludes another idea which these two scientists, Elbaz and Bisson, come up with. It's called the mega watershed model. If you look at the second, it's based on mapping based on space technology by remote sensing. The idea says that this is a short of it. It's a long study. It's available on internet. You can also, but the short of it is that actually what they say, rain and snow in the lower areas, that's what is measured usually by meteorological stations. That's most of the water which is accounted for. They say, first of all, most of the rainfall precipitation happens in the upper regions of the mountain areas, which are difficult to measure. So that's 80% of the amount of water, rainwater, which is not accounted for. And what happens is that because of the shifts in the earth crust, tectonic shifts, when the mountains were created in previous geological ages, and the continuous tectonic seismic activity, what you have is you have cracks, very deep cracks, which are vertical, most of them. And through these cracks, the water tries to find its way to new areas. So this is a huge amount of water which is not accounted for. What usually people talk about is the water which is trapped here. This is the horizontal aquifers. But this is both an enormous amount of water, much larger amount of water, but it has another special thing. It can travel for hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers. So you can find water where you never imagine it, underground. You have the world's largest, and these two scientists have discovered some enormous water reservoirs, like Farouk Elbaz in 2006 in the middle of the Darfur crisis. he visited Sudan and he presented his study, and he told the Sudanese government, because the fight in Darfur was not a political fight in the beginning, it was made a political fight by the British and their supporters in the United States. The fight in Darfur was between different tribes over water, nomadic tribes against settled tribes. And some people had the bright idea to use it and turn it into a political crisis. But he went to Sudan and said, we have, under Darfur, we have a mega lake. I think he says that it's as big as Lake Erie in the United States. And you can immediately dig 1,000 wells, large wells, which can pump water for more than 100 years. He said, I guarantee you this. And that's the way you can create peace in Darfur, by bringing water. So their studies, they use remote sensing by discovering so-called underground rivers or ancient rivers that are being used now, like in the mountain ranges of Africa. When it rains, that water goes down in underground rivers or so-called ancient rivers. This is the area in Darfur, and you can see there, Al-Baz says, it was the other side. Under the sand, there is a formation of a mega lake, a huge lake, which existed in ancient times before the Ice Age. And that water has been accumulating underneath that. And by studying the formation of the surface of the lake, which is under the sand, you can't see it. You have to use space technology to be able to figure out. So he said there was a lake there which existed at least 5,000 years, and it was providing water for the deep aquifers, which is now the Darfur aquifer. There are discovery of water in Egypt, in southern Egypt, near Al Uwaynat area. There's enormous agricultural activity there, right in the desert areas. The Libyan Great Man-Made River. This is also one of the. They have been pumping water. The problem is that they are pumping water to take to the coast, to the capital and to Sirte and these other, which are on the coast. So the desert is not affected positively by the water they bring out. So the water is taken somewhere else. If you show the Arabian River, Arabian Ancient River. This is a river which is underneath Saudi Arabia. It's an ancient river. And it goes from this high area, which I showed. When the sandstorm comes, it takes a loop or a turn around this high area. And that you have a high range, it's like a higher range of mountains, and also you have the Hijaz Mountains, which lead the water down. This was a river, a surface river before. But now there are oases along this old river. And these are the road which the pilgrims take. In Harun al-Rashid's time, this was called the Zubaydah Road for pilgrims. The wife of Harun al-Rashid, when she used to travel to Mecca to do pilgrimage, she would stay at the different oases on the way to Mecca from Iraq. So this was called Zubaydah Road for the caravans. So we have a lot of historical material on that. So this is the idea that you can actually find water in very, very large amounts, and that this water is not like people say it's underground like the oil. I mean, there's enormous activity in space and on the ground going on to find more oil. But very little is being done to find more water. So the thing is that we have enormous amounts of water under the Saudi desert, under the African desert, and of course, there is disagreement on this theory, but Al-Baz have proven it several times. But this water there is not only stored since millions of years. That's what they say. They say this water was stored for millions of years, and it's for the future generations. You cannot take it from the future generations. Well, if it's for the future generations, some generation should start it. We are the future generation for the people who were before us. So they say, no, you don't touch that. This is for the future generations. So it's totally crazy idea. Of course we have the future generations, but what we're going to give the future generations is no desert. We'll give them green areas. But we have to start doing it now. So this watershed theory, or it's a model. It's practiced. I mean, this is a company called Earth Water Technology. They have stuff on YouTube, and they have dug wells in Trinidad and Tobago. There was a real water crisis there. They said rather than building a dam to serve for the water, with lower cost, they helped the government this is so these are proven. Now, in the empty quarter desert in Saudi Arabia, they started digging wells, very deep wells, more than 1,000, more than a kilometer deep, thousands of kilometers actually, and they are finding water. So that water is going from the empty quarter to the Jizan city in southwest Saudi Arabia. But this is a very limited thing. This is not oil, this is water. But the oil industry is only interested in the... Yeah, all right. Okay, just quickly, so now we discussed the water sources. What needs to be developed then is the agricultural policy. And there is a very crucial issue here. I mean, people talk about amounts of water. The problem is that what they don't discuss, like energy, a concept which Lyndon LaRouche calls the energy flux density. It's not enough to have energy. The idea is how are you going to use that energy, in what concentrated form, to create greater effect from that energy. And the same thing applies to water. We can call it water flux density. So you don't use water in any way. So you have 1 cubic meter of water. It's not 1 cubic of water in a general sense. It depends how you are using it. It depends on the technological advancement of that economy, how that cubic meter of water is used. So we have to have new irrigation and agriculture technologies, including biogenetics, to develop, as I said, new forms of plants, seeds, trees, which will resist and save more water. This is one technique which is quite efficient, but it's greenhouse techniques called, there are two, the hydroponics and aeroponics. You don't need soil. You plant mostly vegetables, and this is quite popular now in the United Arab Emirates, but also in Australia and other countries. You plant the seeds in plastic containers or fiber containers in water, and that water is enriched with minerals, which the plant needs, and it's very, very efficient and both quick and very productive. The other system you have, it's called aeroponics. You don't sink the roots in the water, you keep them hanging, like the hanging gardens, and you flush water with minerals on the roots directly. So that way you are saving enormous amount of water, but also that you don't have the risk of evaporation because you are building it in a greenhouse environment, and the water which evaporates is recycled. So this is a very, very efficient. There are some there are statistics how efficient this can compare to open field. We can move further to other, because it's time limit. We have this. We will never anymore, like in the Middle East it's common, and in Egypt you flood the field with water, and then the plants take what they take and the rest goes to God or to evaporation. That will not be allowed anymore in our plan. We will use modern technology and more efficient use of the same amount of water, but by this so-called dripping technique. This is it's used in Australia, Israel. The Israelis have been very effective in developing these technologies in the University of Negev. They have enormous studies about that. So you bring the water directly to the plant. So you don't waste water around the plant. You take it directly to the plant. More sophisticated system is called the subsurface technique. This is a modern dripping system. By bringing the water, actually, before you plant, you plant the water, the pipes, so they can reach the root directly. They don't need to go from the plant to the root, but they can water the root directly. So that you can save like 90% of the water this way. So this is the use of modern science and modern technology to create what we can call water flux density by concentrating the water to the utmost amount of use you can get of it. So these technologies exist. So there are two, I had two cautionary things. One about the Turkey, the Turkish project, the impressive Turkish project, which we talked about. There's a big problem there because the Turkish government, with the aid of the United States Agriculture Department, is that they are turning that region into one of the world's largest cotton production areas. And the cotton is known, it's the most thirsty kind of crop. It takes like 4 or 5 times the amount of water which growing wheat, for example, takes. It's enormous amount of water which goes into the cotton plantation. And the Aral Sea was dried up because the Soviets were growing cotton on the sides of the Aral Sea. So it takes enormous amounts of water and also chemicals to grow the cotton. So this is a real problem. And then they export it, they think it's cheap export because they have the water, but it's not cheap. That water is not cheap. That water, if used in the right way, this is more valuable than oil. So there's one problem with that. There's a wrong agricultural policy. We had the case of Saudi Arabia. In the 1980s and 1990s, they had an impressive program to produce wheat. And Saudi Arabia went from a net importer of wheat to the 6th largest world exporter of wheat. And we have some images, and it looks quite impressive. They are building, this is where most of the plants are in this high region, the high area, where I said there is this old river. And they were pumping water to, these arrows are exactly where the sandstorm passed by. But if you go to the next, no, before. No, this. So they planting wheat on these, it's called the central rotating sprinkler systems. It's quite efficient, but in a different climate. But you look around you, there are no trees. Where are the palm trees which will create the shadow? Where are the olive trees? You know, where are the vineyards? So I think the Saudis should read the Quran a bit more carefully. And then what they do is that they deplete the soil there and they move to another area. So if you go back to the original picture, you see it's only these things. There are no plants. And the sandstorms and the desert is not affected by it. And they used in the 10 years, and now Saudi Arabia, they stopped that project now because it was a total failure, because they don't have agriculture sector. They bring foreign companies, they use the water, and they export the wheat. So nothing happens in Saudi Arabia. You don't have skilled farmers. You don't have infrastructure built in this area. You don't have forests which can change the climate and save the water and the soil. So this is totally crazy kind of policy. They used, in 10 years, I guess, 300 billion cubic meters. It's like 6 times the flow of the Nile, annual flow of the Nile. And there has been no effect at all on the desert over these 10 years. So if that water was used, it's important for nations to produce their own food, but you don't do it that way. You do it in the way we said. You combine it with other crops where you can create a different climate and you have variations. So you can preserve the soil, you preserve the water, you change the climate. And this is what needs to be done. So this is a kind of wrong policy. It looks impressive, but it didn't do any good. And they now shut down all these. Most of these, there are very little of that left. So the same thing goes for petrochemical industry. They also is cheap export. I think we're being warned about the time. But we're going to have a study which will be published in EIR. It's also the petrochemical industry, also massive investment in the Gulf in petrochemical industry, but it's all export-oriented. It does not change the land, does not change society. It's foreign companies who come and use the cheap gas, and they produce aluminum, they use other petrochemical, iron, but it's exported. It's not used in Saudi Arabia. The population and the economy in Saudi Arabia, the physical economy is not affected. We have the transport thing. I'm not going to go through it. The integration of this region with the Eurasian land bridge. but you can have a final look of what it will look like. I mean, even the Saudis and the others, they're building railroads in the region, but they are not going anywhere. They're going to mines, phosphate and bauxite mines in northern Saudi Arabia. But if we do what Helga was proposing, what we have been discussing now here, we can connect this region very quickly to the rest of the Eurasian land bridge, because right now it's an isolated corner. You have enormous ports in the Gulf and airports, like Dubai. It's one of the world's biggest ports and airports. But it does not affect what you need is land-based transport systems which will connect Asia. For Dubai, Iran and Iraq are the biggest importers of the goods which come to Dubai. So they should integrate their economy into Iran rather than going for these wars. The last thing which I want to finish with is the question of social development and the current... do we have an image of the green... yeah, it's coming. It'll come later. But the greening of the desert, the globe map. Yeah. Anyway, so there's this question of social development, which plays a key role now in the war situation and the rise of fundamentalism and religious wars. So in Southwest Asia, there's a very paradoxical situation when it comes to the correlation of living standards, culture, education, and economic and financial resources. Traditionally, or since the oil crisis of 1973, these countries have been divided into two categories, the so-called rich ones and the poor cousins. The rich ones are the oil-exporting countries in the Gulf and the Gulf Cooperation Council, with small populations and large mineral wealth. They are also members of the British Imperial Club and are cuddled by the United States and Europe. The other ones have less such resources and larger populations, but have been cursed by the British and the United States. These are Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinian people, and Egypt. Jordan has been moving back and forth between the two camps. The paradox is that the population in the seemingly poor countries have much higher levels of education, labor skills, and deeper sense of historical identity. The former ones, the rich ones, are living in a strange dichotomy between material wealth and primitive traditions and religious fundamentalism, mostly dominated by the Salafi Wahhabi doctrine. These so-called rich societies are framed on the model of the Venetian oligarchic system. Technological progress is welcome, but only as a pragmatic tool of power, not for the improvement of the cultural and physical conditions of the citizens of the states or their future missions. An educated middle class is obviously a political threat to the ruling families. The discrepancy between the small native labor force and the foreign workers, it's about 80 to 90% in this private sector in Saudi Arabia, is guest workers. While the Saudi youth are unemployed, they go to religious schools instead. This will pose serious questions and problems in the near future, as mass unemployment among the natives pose increase and the lack of basic labor rights among the guest workers become more tangible as their wages do not match the real increase in the prices globally. Obviously, it's difficult to sustain a society with half slaves. In the other group of nations, a great number of the best brains and educated persons had to flee these countries due to the many wars, civil wars, political oppression, and invasion of foreign armies in the case of Iraq, or foreign-backed terrorist groups as in the case of Syria today. Economic sanctions against Iraq, Iran, and Syria and IMF World Bank policies imposed on Egypt have led to the deterioration of living standards, infrastructure, and education systems. All this had led to sending back these nations many decades backwards. Our program for the development of the region would shift this imbalance drastically, as both the financial wealth, mineral wealth, human resources, and skills would be directed towards one unified mission for all the countries. Youth among the natives would be trained to join the labor force to build their nations and green the desert in similar fashion as Franklin Roosevelt's era's New Deal and associated civilian conservation corps. That program which pulled unemployed people in the Depression era of the United States from the streets into the national reconstruction projects and turned the United States into the most powerful economic power on earth during and after World War II. The brain drain would be stopped, and hundreds of thousands of scientists and well-educated people working in exile or as expatriates in Europe and the Americas would feel safe to come home and serve their nations. The financial, mineral wealth, and whatever national credit that can be generated in the rich countries can be balanced against the skills of the labor of the others in the short term, and in the short term launch a construction process immediately. Through constituting a common authority as an executive organ among the relevant states in the region, taking responsibility for implementing these proposed projects jointly, and providing credit among these nations rather than sending militants and arms across the borders of each other, these projects can be started immediately. Each nation would be working simultaneously on its national projects and the regional projects by unifying the objectives of the infrastructure development and the relevant technical standards of construction and operation of the different systems. A common credit system established through a development bank or a Marshall Plan fund can fill the credit gap among the oil-rich, the oil-poor, and the water-poor countries. Nations like Yemen and Jordan will not be left for the mercy of the IMF or the Obama's drones, or just because they cannot pull together their credit potentials to launch an economic development process. A nation like Jordan will be aided to build its first nuclear power plant and utilize human and natural sources such as phosphate and uranium and upgrade them and become a rich nation within one generation, rather than waiting desperately for the handouts from the US, EU, and the IMF or World Bank. Sharing of the know-how, for example, in dealing with desert conditions, agricultural questions can be dealt with most effectively through establishing a unified scientific research center functioning under the common executive authority. Right now, and due to the Anglo-Saudi and US policies of sowing religious strife and wars in the whole region, all the way to the Caucasus and China's west, the whole region is threatened by 30 years religious sectarian war, from which this region might never recover. It took hundreds of years to heal the wounds of the Crusades and Mongol invasions of the Eastern Islamic State and its center in Baghdad. Even after many hundreds of years, the region had hardly any resemblance of what it was during the early Abbasid Caliphate and the Renaissance Baghdad had ushered in the 8th and 9th centuries. The Crusades and the Mongol invasion in 1258 were preceded by almost 100 years of similar sectarian and religious strife, disputes and political manipulations through religion, exactly as is happening today. This vicious cycle can and have to be broken. There are global preconditions, of course, such as shifting the murderous geopolitical system of divide and conquer of the British Empire, and also restructuring the financial and banking system. These are required to give these nations a signal to shift of focus from destruction to construction. And I would like to end with a quote from a person who is also German. Helga mentioned him, Wilhelm von Kardorf, who also has a clear idea what the true American system is. He says, according to Henry Carey, the American economist, national wealth depends on the outstanding, perfected domination of a people over the gratuitous powers of nature. The more a nation is capable of increasing, number one, the richness and abundance of her soil and the diversity of her natural products, number two, by perfection of tools by which the powers of nature are made to serve man, that is capital, number three, through the intellectual education of her people, human labor, to acquire that domination. If that's done, the more her advance in wealth ahead of other nations will be. So that's the requirement for shifting a society. So I stop here. I welcome all of you soon to read the report we are putting together. And as Helga said, you can choose between these two world pictures. You can choose to be on the side of the war for the empire and destroy civilization, or you can help rebuild civilization. Thank you.